Nice to be here again. Here's what we've done already. Yesterday, theoretical lessons. Today we're moving on to clinical lessons. I'm not going to summarize all of this because it'll take us too much time. Just letting you see some key words of what we covered yesterday. I'm going to send all these slides to you. Somebody yesterday said I must please add 2 slides. One of them must name the 3 levels of the different affect systems, the sensory affects, the emotional affects, and the homeostatic affects. I'll do that. I'll add those slides to this, and then I'll send you all of these slides in the next few days. This is just reminding you visually, that's an important one. And then that's what we did in the afternoon. This was an important one. And then we went through all the different instinctual systems. They were very important. And then we get to today. Clinical lessons. I'm going to be talking to you now for 2 hours covering this material. And then after coffee, we're going to have a case presentation, and after lunch, another case presentation. And in those case presentations, I'm hoping that all of the material that we've covered theoretically yesterday and that we're going to cover now this morning, that all of that will be illustrated in relation to clinical cases, which is, of course, where we do our actual work. I'm going to start today just by, I thought there are 2 ways I could start. Either I could start by asking you, are there any burning questions? Now that you've spent the night digesting what I said to you yesterday, there might be some questions or confusions that have arisen that we could start by addressing those immediately. Or I thought I can just dive in with today's material, and then as we go along, it'll leave us more time for questions. And I thought if it's all right with you, I'll go with the second approach so that we don't shorten our time too much in terms of the material that I want to cover before we get to the clinical cases. But remember, do feel free to interrupt me. And if I don't use all the 2 hours now, we'll have time for general questions and discussion at the end. So the first line on the screen says, implications of the conscious id for the talking cure. And this, I already said to you yesterday that there were major implications for our clinical work arising from the realization, the apparent fact, that the part of the brain that performs the functions that Freud called id functions, that part of the brain generates consciousness. It is not a part of the brain that functions unconsciously. And not only does it generate consciousness, it generates all consciousness. All consciousness derives from the part of the brain that performs id functions. That is to say, the part of the brain that represents the demands of the body, of the internal body, upon the mind to perform work by virtue of the embodiment of the mind. That part of the brain performing those functions does so consciously, which means that the demands of the body upon the mind are felt. They are not unconscious, and this is the crucial point. For Freud, drives were unconscious things that only become known once they reach not only the ego, but the very surface of the ego, the perceptual consciousness system. And I pointed out not only that the evidence, the scientific evidence, speaks strongly against this, but also that once we see the strength of the evidence for the view that id functions are in fact conscious functions, then we see that actually the theory itself was internally contradictory. It's not possible for the id to be governed, the passage of events in the id, as Freud put it, to be governed by the pleasure principle if it's an unconscious part of the mind. Because the pleasure principle, by definition, it's an affective principle. Affects, as Freud always said, are felt. There's no such thing as an unconscious affect. You can't have a feeling that you don't feel. And yet, Freud said that the pleasure principle, this feeling principle, governs the passage of events in the id, and he said that the id is unconscious, and that is mutually contradictory statements. So we had to take a deep breath, and I'm asking you, I have already taken that deep breath and accepted that this was an error. The id is in fact conscious. And drives, we have autonomic functions, which are not mental functions, but once the autonomic functions reach their limits, then there are demands upon the mind to do something. The autonomic self-regulatory or vegetative regulatory functions of the visceral body, once they require something from the outside world, that's when drive arises. That's when the demand upon the ego arises to perform work in the outside world via thought and directed action and learning from experience. And this moment, this transition from autonomic to voluntary mental functioning coincides with the transition from unconscious or non-conscious bodily functions to conscious mental functions, which are feelings. The demands of the body upon the mind to perform work are felt. That's what feelings are, and that's what feelings are for. And that indeed is what all consciousness is for, and I'll come to that in a moment. But for now, I'm just reminding you what I said, what I meant, what I mean when I say that the id is conscious. I then spoke to you about everything we've learnt about those drives, and indeed about higher motivational mechanisms built over the drives that we call instincts. Once we identified this part of the brain that performs what Freud called id functions, it becomes possible to learn new things about id functions. The biggest thing that we've learned is that drives and instincts are felt. They're conscious. And indeed, that is what gives them their compulsive, peremptory, motivational power, is the fact that we feel them. And this, of course, corresponds to our ordinary experience. Everybody knows how demanding, how insistent, how compulsive are the pressures that come with feelings, the demands that they make upon us, the imperative demands that they make upon us. What we learned is that there are different categories of feelings. There are what we call homeostatic affects, which have to do with the direct needs of the body, hunger, thirst, and so on. And then there are instinctual needs, which have to do with fear, separation, distress, rage, lust, things like that. And then the more externally oriented ones, which we call sensory affects, disgust, surprise, pain, and so on. All of this is new knowledge. All of this is very important knowledge. And I emphasized yesterday afternoon, especially the 7 emotional affects, which correspond with 7 mammalian instincts, which are built into the human brain, and which I said, I think, are the mainstay or the mainspring of psychiatric pathology, of psychopathology. And I try to justify that statement and illustrate some of the promising lines of inquiry and new ways of thinking about psychopathology that arise from a new understanding, a new taxonomy of the drives and the instincts, all of which are conscious, and they give rise to predictions as to what we must do in order to meet these needs. And the instinctual predictions are innate. They're built into our brains, not by way of little movies and little memories, fantasies. They are built into our brains just in terms of blind. When this happens, I do that. And I explained to you in terms of ordinary genetic theory how this happens, how these behavioral inclinations, how these behavioral tendencies are inherited, how we are born with such tendencies without having any phylogenetic memories in the episodic sense of the word attached to them. Now, this leads to the next question, which is if the id is conscious, then what about the ego? And I made the statement yesterday that the ego is unconscious, that it is intrinsically unconscious, and that this is one of the other main discoveries of the cognitive. What I've summarized for you so far is what we've learned in affective neuroscience since the 1990s. And one of the main findings of cognitive neuroscience from the 1980s and 1990s was that cognition is intrinsically unconscious, that cortical functions and forebrain functions in general are intrinsically unconscious. In other words, they do not require consciousness in order to do their thing. By cognition, I mean things like perception and things like memory, things like thinking and finding a route, reading a sentence, recognizing a face, all of these sorts of cognitive operations, performing a mathematical sum, etc. All of that can be done without awareness, without consciousness. And this was a surprise to our colleagues in the cognitive neurosciences, and they were driven to the conclusion, and in fact I never said this to you yesterday, there was a famous review paper by two authors, Baj and Chartrand, and the paper had the lovely title, The Unbearable Automaticity of Being. And it's a review of the cognitive literature in which they came to the conclusion that 95% of our waking goal-directed acts are executed unconsciously. 95%. So, this is very much like the same sort of conclusion that we were driven to from a completely different point of view in psychoanalysis, that it's not only that there is an unconscious mind, but rather that most of the mind is unconscious. And in this instance, we are talking about the ego, the mind in its cognitive, reality-oriented sense of the word. So the id, as I've said to you, is conscious, it's full of feeling. These feelings make demands upon the ego to perform work, and the ego, I'm reminding you, is inherently an unconscious thing. Then the question arose for our cognitive colleagues, and I raised the question with you yesterday, then why are we conscious of why are we so conscious of our perceptions and our cognitions, our memories and so on, if they do not require consciousness in their ordinary day-to-day operations 95% of the time, then why are they 5% of the time conscious? Why are 5% of our cognitive operations executed consciously? And the answer emerged from a theory which was introduced gradually from the mid-1990s and continued to be developed. In fact, it's still being developed by Antonio Damasio, which the essence of the idea was cognitive consciousness is inherently affective. In other words, cognition, when it's just purely cognitive, is unconscious. And when cognition becomes conscious, it's when it is felt. In other words, when we palpate, when we sample our cognitive operations or activate our cognitive operations from below with affective arousal, then we feel our cognitions. And the question as to why should we feel our cognitions is intrinsic to the function of feeling, which is that it is value driven. That feelings come in two broad varieties. They're either good feelings or they're bad feelings. They're pleasant or they're unpleasant. Pleasant feelings, says Damasio, are at their absolute foundations. They have the meaning that this is good for me within a biological scale of values. This will enhance my chances of surviving and reproducing, and unpleasurable feelings mean the opposite. This is bad for my chances of survival and reproductive success. That's what feelings are for, says Damasio. And that's what consciousness is for, because consciousness is intrinsically feeling arising from upper brainstem and limbic structures. And we need to feel our way through our cognitions when we are uncertain. In other words, when there is a choice to be made. A choice has to be grounded in a value system where Something is good, something is bad. Something is right, something is wrong. And what is right and good, biologically speaking, the value system of biology is what is right and good is that which enhances my chances of surviving and reproducing. And so feeling tells you this is good, this is bad, which is the basis upon which decisions are made, which is the basis upon which choices are made, which is the basis upon which uncertainty is resolved. And cognitions only need to be conscious during that process, which we call predictive coding. While you're busy trying to formulate a prediction or update a prior prediction to improve it in the light of prediction error, in the light of something not working. Not working, that is to say, in relation again to this fundamental value system that drives the design of the instrument of the mind, that in fact drives the design of the whole of our body, not only of our brains. So on the basis of the idea that this is what consciousness in cognition is for, we came to the idea that the ego tolerates consciousness. The ego endures consciousness. That is to say, it tolerates feeling, it tolerates affect, as long as it has to. But its aim is to resolve the affect. Its aim is to resolve the uncertainty which underpins the affect. In other words, I don't know what to do, I have a need here and I don't know how to meet it. And then there's a question of using that feeling in the here and now in order to determine what works and what doesn't work, with the ultimate aim of resolving the feeling, that is to say, of meeting the need. And then you have a new prediction, and that prediction then becomes the basis for future action and no longer requires consciousness. It then becomes automatic. So we are born with automatic action plans, prior predictions. We then update these prior predictions in the light of learning from experience. Experience being prediction error, meaning arousal, meaning need, meaning feeling, meaning consciousness, which we then try and resolve by further learning from experience, with the aim ultimately of zombiedom, nirvana. Heaven is a place where nothing ever happens. This is what the ego is aspiring to. And so we come to the conclusion that the id is conscious and the ego aspires to unconsciousness. And it's exactly upside down from the way that we used to think about it. Then, yes, please. Yeah, were you here yesterday? So when I spoke of the ego being overwhelmed, and this is what I was leading to now, I was saying that the ego aspires to automatization. The ego aspires to resolving problems so that it no longer needs to be conscious, which is the whole purpose, the whole aim of the ego learning from experience. And then I said that there's a cleavage within the ego, and this is where we can integrate psychodynamic conceptions of the unconscious with cognitive conceptions of the unconscious. These have previously been seen as competing points of view, that there are two types of unconscious, which is, of course, a nonsense in science. You can't say, well, we think it works like this, and they think it works like that, and we don't agree. You know, you have to resolve disagreements in science. You have to look at the evidence, and you have to say, well, how can we reconcile these two points of view with each other, either by finding one point of view or the other is wrong, or that they're both wrong, and that you then come to a resolved account that is able to bear all the evidence, and that gives rise to new testable predictions. So the view that I put to you yesterday is that the way in which we can reconcile these two perspectives with each other is that the ego does not only automatize solutions, predictions that work. It also automatizes some predictions that don't work, because the task of continuing to try to resolve the problem in question overwhelms the ego and is pointless to continue, because the ego is incapable of solving the problem. Now, you ask about forbidden wishes, and I made the point yesterday that we have 7 instinctual needs. And remember, I also, if I may just say this as an aside, remember I also made the point that these 7 instinctual or emotional affects, it's slightly artificial to say that the sensory ones don't count, or the homeostatic ones don't count. And we spoke, for example, yesterday about disgust as an example of a sensory affect, which certainly plays a part in psychopathology. And we spoke of eating disorders in relation to hunger, which is a homeostatic affect. And we showed, these things certainly do get drawn into psychopathology. So it's slightly artificial to focus only on these 7. But, one has to, for didactic purposes, one has to simplify a little bit. But even with those 7, that's not only a matter of the ego having to learn how to meet each one of those instinctual needs, each one of those demands, the affects that go with them, which compulsively drive us into the world to seek solutions as to how to meet these imperative needs, which are absolutely unavoidable. Each of them by themselves is hard enough, but we also have to reconcile them with each other. And this is where the question that you ask, where we begin to find this problem in the life of the mind. So, for example, I spoke yesterday of the instinct for attachment, which has got, all of these things have many different names. It's called the panic system, or the grief system, or the attachment system. And this has the imperative that I must keep my caregiver close to me. This makes me feel safe. I want to have her looking after me and nearby, at hand, always. And there's an affect that goes with that. If you separate it from her, there's panicky separation distress, and ultimately, if this persists, there's despair. I spoke about all of that. Then there's another system, which is the need to get rid of frustrating objects. Impediments to your meeting. There's the thing I want. Here is my desire for it, and this thing's in my way. And there's an instinctual system that deals with that situation. The affect is irritation, leading ultimately to rage. And the prediction is, I must attack the thing and get rid of it. I must annihilate it. This is the prediction arising from the rage circuit. And what happens if these two things both are felt if you feel both of these things in relation to one and the same object? In other words, what happens when you are enraged by your caregiver? There you have a forbidden impulse. There's the beginnings of and it's an intrapsychic forbidden impulse. It is you yourself do not want to annihilate the very object that you depend upon. And then I gave further examples. That example came up several times yesterday, but I gave further examples of when I spoke about romantic love. In the broader sense of the word, not just lust. I spoke about the need to reconcile lust with, for example, attachment, which has 2 aspects to it, the nurture and care and the being cared for. And there's, as we all know from our clinical experience, it's quite hard to, this is the origin of the Madonna whore syndrome. It's the need to reconcile from the point of view of one instinctual need, is an entirely appropriate behavior, but reconciling that with the fact that you have exactly the same object, have these entirely different instinctual impulses towards, how do you integrate lustful with what Freud called affectionate feelings? And there you have exactly, right at the heart of the Oedipal, the difficulties of forbidden impulses toward a love object. Let alone, adding to that, in addition to the attachment feelings, there's also the seeking what else is available. That's another kind of forbidden impulse. Some of you are laughing. I won't tell your spouses. And that's how we would begin to think about this. In none of these instinctual systems is there a built-in verboten. It's in relation to each other that what is forbidden arises. It's out of conflict. Say that again? Yes, and so the superego is something that I've relatively neglected yesterday, and this came up only once or twice in our discussions. I spoke of if I may remind you, that there are 3 different levels of consciousness. First of all, I said there's a distinction between affective consciousness and cognitive consciousness. That's 2 levels. And when I say 2 levels, I need first of all to remind you that cognitive consciousness is derivative, that you only have cognitive consciousness on the basis of affective consciousness. In the absence of affective consciousness, there can be no cognitive consciousness. But then I said cognitive consciousness is further subdivided into two categories. And there, again, many different terms that different investigators use for these things. But we all generally agreed that there are two types of cognitive consciousness. There's a simple cognitive consciousness, which is called phenomenal or primary, and then there's a complex cognitive consciousness, which is called secondary or reflective or higher order thoughts, and so on. And the crucial distinction between these two grades of cognitive consciousness is that the one is concrete. It is, as I said, a second person. It's a you. It's just it's a feeling about an object. And then in the second order, higher order, reflective type of consciousness, it's a reflecting back upon your own consciousness. So it's a thinking about your cognitions and your affects. And the thinking about, the reflecting upon, the abstracting yourself from the third person point of view, seeing yourself as an object rather than just as an affective being having object experiences. It's an affective being having object experiences, and from the point of view of the object, I myself am an object about whom the object is having experiences. And so that reflective, the capacity to take the position of the other in relation to your own experience, that type of consciousness is the vehicle of superego functioning. And there too I need to remind you that you cannot have that kind of consciousness unless you have the primary cognitive consciousness, which you cannot have unless you have affective consciousness. So it's not just three types of consciousness, it's three grades which are all nested in each other. I need to emphasize again that the primary font, the source, the basis of all consciousness is affective feeling. First you have to have an affective sentient being present in the world in order to have a perception of the world, and let alone to be able to abstract yourself from that and reflect upon how you are affectively present in the world and how you are an object in the world for other affective presences. So it's very much a contingent process. So you can see once you have this kind of capacity, how this begins to fit into your first question. So for example, I use the paradigmatic example. I say paradigmatic in relation to superego function, because it is the system whereby we begin to find our place in the group. And this is the play system. And again, you must remember these systems all have names which are not necessarily the best words. Words can be very misleading. Another way of talking about the play system is to speak about the territorial system or about the dominance system. These things overlap with each other. But the crucial point there is that the play system requires you to take account of other minds. It requires you to in order to gratify your own play desires, which could also be called dominance desires or social hierarchy desires or territorial desires, competitive desires, and so on, that system works in such a way, and I won't tell you all of the details again, but it works in such a way that you do not get what you want unless you take account of what the other wants. And so there you have something which meshes with the cognitive capacity that I spoke of in terms of higher order thought or reflective consciousness, the third person point of view, the internalization of the viewpoint of the other, the objectification of the self, etc. All of that meshes first and foremost with the instinctual properties of the play system and the dominance system to begin to account for the complex developmental phenomena that we call superego formation. But those are just the rudiments of what would need to be a much more elaborated account of superego development within the point of view, within the framework of the new knowledge that I summarized for you yesterday. Now, what I'm leading up to is the following. I've said to you that the id is conscious, and I've said to you that does not mean that there is no such thing as the unconscious. It just means that there is something else that's separate from the id, which is the unconscious. And I have now told you what the unconscious is. In the light of all the evidence that accumulated over the last 30 years, we have to say that the id and the unconscious are two different things, literally in two different locations, performing two different functions, which of course are closely integrated with each other. And that the id is innate. We're born with it. It's instinctual. It is given. It is purely biological. And then through the learning through experience of how do I meet my needs in the world, a conscious ego develops, out of which is deposited unconscious predictions. And some of these are adaptive, what Freud would call the unconscious ego, and others are, let's say, illegitimate or premature, prematurely automatized, illegitimately ossified, because they are not adaptive in the sense of actually meeting our needs in the world. Rather, they are cutting our losses, not thinking about it anymore, can't cope with this one. These are the portions of the automatisms derived from ego development that we call the dynamic unconscious or the repressed. And so we have now a broad picture of the id and the ego, with a few little details about the superego, thanks to your question. And we have a problem in terms of our classical technique arising from what I've summarized for you. And this is the starting point of the main things I want to talk to you about this morning. Sorry, if I may, because I'm distracted now by a thought, so hold it there. That's what I'm going to say to you. Now I'm going to this little footnote here. Exactly. Thank you for reminding me that that's the principle that governs me. The question about the superego. I want to remind you that yesterday I also spoke about after repression in the sense of the very basic, it just underpins all of the giving up on the reality principle. In other words, I'm no longer going to try to solve this in the world. I can't. This is insoluble for me. This I'm cutting my losses on. This overwhelms me. I'm just doing it this way even though it doesn't work. Fuck it. Okay? That, the repressed, that leaves you with the problem that all those needs are not met. And so you have all these affects and you don't know where they're coming from and you don't have a plan that works as to how to deal with them. And then I said, those affects have to themselves be dealt with, and this is where all the other defenses come from. And I spoke of, and this gives shape, character, personality to the ego. Cognitive style, if you want to call it that. How I deal with the feelings that I am left with, given the preface that I've just described. And there you can have neurotic defenses or narcissistic defenses or psychotic defenses. And superego development has a lot to do also with the maturation of your defenses. So narcissistic defenses are what we nowadays, or since the days of Melanie Klein, speak of as primitive superego functions. So what I described in terms of taking a reflective third-person point of view, that's more like the Freudian superego, which is a kind of a adaptive superego. It's a kind of an ego, a superego that accepts the order of how things are, unhappy as they may be. Nevertheless, this is what it's a kind of a depressive position in the Kleinian sense. Whereas in the primitive superego, which Freud never theorized about, that we can only conceptualize using these defenses, the narcissistic defenses, where there's a projection of the bad into the object, which then persecutes you and so on. So all of that is still, obviously we still recognize, acknowledge these dynamics exist, but we understand them in terms of the level of defensive maturation. So now back to my main task. Having described the picture that I have, we face this problem, and there are two problems. the one arises from the other. The first problem is, if the id is conscious and the ego is intrinsically unconscious, then the idea that the fundamental mechanism of the talking cure, which is to drag consciousness down into the id, that this can't be what we're doing. The old idea was that the id, being inchoate, inarticulate, unthinkable, because it's not representational, that the drives have to become represented in words. And in this way, we can think our own desires. We can think our own instinctual drives. We can, where id was, there shall ego be. It's all through the talking cure, the essential mechanism of which is that words being derived from external perception, that is to say, being cortical functions. And I showed you I'm not neurologizing Freud when I say that. Freud knew everything about the brain mechanisms of language. And Freud was a very learned behavioral neurologist and what we nowadays call neuropsychologist, functional neuroanatomist, and so on. It was explicit in his own mind that he's talking about cortical functions which make consciousness possible. This was the essential mechanism of our, supposedly, of our treatment, that we bring consciousness down into the id. This clearly cannot be what we're doing. So that's the first problem that I want to address with you this morning. I want to say, well, if that's not what we're doing, if that can't be what we're doing, then what are we doing? The second problem, which is, as I say, it comes in consequence of the first, is that we then ask the question, well, if the id is conscious, then where is the unconscious? Because every psychoanalyst knows the power of unconscious functions. Where are they? And I've just summarized for you what we concluded. And the bit that I have not reminded you of, but which I spoke of at length yesterday, is that once things are rendered unconscious as opposed to preconscious, in other words, once they are no longer in the declarative memory systems, once they are no longer in the cortical, episodic, and semantic memory systems, once they are truly unconscious, in both senses of the word, that is to say, cognitively unconscious, non-declarative, and dynamically unconscious, repressed, then they are no longer subject to reconsolidation. That was a very important point that I emphasized yesterday, by which I mean, by reconsolidation, let me remind you, it's the updating of the prediction. The prediction gets updated by being activated. It's activated due to its salience. Its salience is its prediction error. So this thing doesn't work. Therefore, it becomes salient. In other words, there's prediction error, the affect, the need returns, and that has to be attached to the prediction which has failed in its task, and that activation of the prediction brings it to consciousness, which makes it labile once more. This is the essence of the mechanism of reconsolidation, that literally the proteins encoding the long-term memory are dissolved, and then there is a state of lability in the trace, and then a new memory, a new prediction is laid down. That works better, and that then becomes the new unconscious prediction. That process of bringing back to mind, reactivating in images, thinking your way through the problem once more, is only possible with cortical memories. Subcortical memories, non-declarative or associative boom boom, this leads to that. They are not images. They are not representations in the sense of cortical pictures, a reactivation of an experience or of the words, the abstractions, the semantic formulation in thinkable codes. This is gone. That's the essence of what happens once a memory becomes non-declarative. Some memories, remember, are non-declarative from the beginning, but through the process of iterative consolidation and reconsolidation, ultimately those predictions which prove reliable are deeply consolidated, so deeply consolidated that they're no longer subject to revision. And I told you yesterday why that was an adaptive mechanism in two important ways. It's a powerfully adaptive mechanism for learning from experience. And remember, I say once more, that is the goal of all learning from experience. We don't want to have to revise our hypotheses and constantly rethink things. We want to find a solution that we can reliably, automatically implement unthinkingly, which is what we do 95% of the time. in our waking goal-directed cognitive and execution of our goal-directed actions, goal-directed intentions. So those prematurely or illegitimately automatized predictions cannot be brought back to mind. They cannot be, and that relates to another fundamental problem in relation to what we do clinically, where we classically have said what we do is we undo repressions. This is what when I say we attach words to things that are unconscious, in regard to the repressed, what we are saying is that we're trying to bring the repressed back to mind so that we can re-problematize it and think it through once more. Now, if what I've summarized for you yesterday about the nature of the unconscious in light of all the contemporary evidence is correct, then that is not possible. What I've just said to you, that what we do is we try to reverse repressions, that would not be possible. Now, I said to you that I have spoken to colleagues, and I am a psychoanalyst, I'm a Freudian, deeply committed to our field. I'm not wild, I'm not Freud bashing, I'm not wanting to throw babies out with bathwaters. It was very unhappy for me to come to these conclusions. I didn't welcome, I really don't like it at all. But, you know, we are, as I said to you yesterday, really doing service in the best possible way to the Freudian tradition, to psychoanalytic truth-seeking. If we accept reality doesn't fit with our wishes, it isn't the way that we want it to be. The evidence suggests that something else is going on. And so I reluctantly pursued this line of thought and looked at my own clinical work, formed clinical groups where we look at each other's clinical work, considering these issues. But I also asked analytic colleagues all over the world, the core of the repressed is the Oedipus complex, is it not? Yes. The aim of psychoanalytic treatment is to undo repressions, is it not? Yes. How many of your patients have remembered their Oedipus complex? How many of them have you undone that repression? And they say, oh gosh, thank you, doctor, for reminding me. I forgot that I wanted to sleep with my mother and kill my father. But now I remember. Let me revise the solutions I came to. I remember now I wanted to make babies with my mother. You know, but I didn't know how to, so I came up with a silly childish theory. I remember it now. Let me revise my theory. It never, ever happens. And that is very simple. I mean, you know, when we speak about evidence-based medicine, this is evidence of a very simple kind. No psychoanalyst anywhere, and I'm sure there will eventually be one, and I'm not sure I'll trust him. But, you know, the exception will prove the rule. I've spoken to many groups like you, here you are, experienced clinicians, and I say to you, how often has that happened? And you know, if nobody puts up their hand, you have to remember we're saying this is the core claim. The core claim is, the core of the repressed is the Oedipus complex. And the aim of the treatment is to undo repression, and yet we never do it. So clearly what we think we're doing, what we say we're doing, and I don't mean we're liars, you know, I mean we're deceiving ourselves. We are not doing what we think we're doing. So let's now think, well, what are we doing? I'm now going to tell you what I think we are doing, and please note the way that I'm putting it. I'm not saying I'm now going to tell you what you must do. I'm saying to you, I'm going to tell you what I think we mostly are doing anyway, because that's been my experience. As I thought this through and worked it through with colleagues, so I came to the conclusion that we actually don't do what we think we do. We actually don't do what we say we do. We're actually doing something else. And I think this is because we've learned implicitly, if you'll forgive the irony, we've learned non-declaratively to do something different because it works better. So we're relying upon automatisms, we're relying upon predictions in our clinical work that we now need to make ourselves more aware of, so that we can be clear and lucid and rational and able to communicate with each other and other disciplines about what we're actually doing. In the process of saying what I'm going to say to you now, therefore, for the most part, I'm going to tell you things which I expect you're going to recognize as, aha, yes, that is what I do. That is what we do. There will also be some parts of what I'm going to say to you which are shifts of emphasis. I think I'm going to nudge you toward doing a little bit more explicitly, perhaps doing a little bit more emphatically, perhaps a little more confidently, some things that perhaps you sometimes do now or that you sometimes don't do now. But it's not going to be a radical, suddenly now you're going to do something completely different with your patients. I think that it's a matter of emphasis, it's a matter of degree, it's a matter of relatively subtle shifts in technique. The main change in what I'm going to be saying to you is clarity of thought about what we're doing, so that what we do is consistent with what we think we're doing, which is consistent, in other words, with our theory of how the mind works in health and disease, and which, happily, is also consistent with what our neighboring disciplines think about how the mind works. And I think that's not small. And remember, all of this is not in order to develop a new language or a new conceptual framework or a new jargon. That's not what neuropsychoanalysis is about. It's not a new school of psychoanalysis. It's an attempt to translate psychoanalytical knowledge into neuroscientific terms so that we can render it accessible to the experimental research methods available to us via the neuroscientific approach. It's not to reduce them to those concepts, it's to translate them so that we can render them accessible to neuroscientific methods of research so that we can continue to progress our discipline, so that we can continue to advance our understanding of how this incredibly complicated thing called the human mind actually works, so that we can help our patients better. So it's not a new language. It's opening us up to new research methods in order to continue to advance our field. These are not speculations. These are scientific hypotheses which are testable. And that's the difference between psychoanalysis itself and neuropsychoanalysis, which is a link between psychoanalysis and the neurosciences. Okay, so now I'm going to go into doing what I've just said. I start with the second line on the screen, which is why our patients suffer mainly from feelings. I said to you yesterday, our patients do suffer mainly from feelings. And I made the semi-joke. I said, our patients don't come to us and say, doctor, there's something I'm unconscious of. Will you please tell me what it is? They say, doctor, I've got this feeling. Will you please take it away? I'm only too conscious of it, but I don't want to have it anymore. That's what our patients do. Now, those two statements, by the way, when I say our patients suffer mainly from feelings, I'm deliberately, consciously alluding to a statement of Freud's when he said hysterics suffer mainly from reminiscences. What Freud meant by that is hysterical, that is to say neurotic symptoms, arise from something that the patient is remembering, in other words, from something the patient has learnt, but they don't know that they've learnt it. That's what he's saying. So hysterics suffer mainly from reminiscences means neurotic symptoms arise from unconscious automatisms. That's also why the mechanism of cure is that one must unautomatize, one must render conscious what is the mechanism of the neurotic symptom, and then the neurotic symptom will be removed. I'm putting it the other way around, saying our patients suffer mainly from feelings, not because they don't suffer from unconscious automatisms. As you can see, I believe they do. But the way in which the patient experiences that is they're left with prediction error, which is a feeling. Because what they're doing doesn't work. Because what they're doing in order to meet a need which they cannot avoid, and I'm talking primarily here of emotional needs of the kind I summarized for you yesterday afternoon. They're doing something to meet that need automatically, unconsciously, but it does not meet that need. That's what I mean by premature automatization of a prediction or illegitimate automatization of a prediction. Even though it doesn't work, that's what they do, and they don't know that that's what they're doing, and they don't know that what they're doing is linked with this feeling that they're left with, because the thing that they're doing is meant to meet the need that underpins that feeling, and it doesn't meet the need. It doesn't fit the bill. It doesn't work. That's why our patients suffer from feelings. In other words, our patients suffer from unmet emotional needs. They're doing something in their lives to meet their emotional needs that doesn't work. And they're doing it automatically and compulsively. They're banging their heads against the wall They don't know that they're doing it and they're suffering the consequences. That is psychopathology. So I say it this way because it tallies with our patient's experience, that they're suffering from feelings. They're not suffering from unconscious memories. And putting it that way, it's not politically correct to side with your patient's experience. It's not a matter of political correctness. It's a matter of you're also dealing with something which is directly observable, something which is easily accessible because, for heaven's sake, it's conscious. And this is what motivates your patient. Your patient is motivated by suffering from a feeling. Now, please remember, as I said to you yesterday, as Einstein said, in science we must simplify as much as possible, but not more than that. Okay, so I'm very much aware I'm simplifying. Otherwise, I can't convey the big picture to you. I'll just say that one time as my little escape hatch, and then I'll go back with the main story. Now, our patients come to us and say, I've got this feeling, will you please take it away? And there are two ways you can answer that question, which is also why I emphasize that this is what motivates our patients. They don't forget, you are not patients. I mean, you once were patients, I presume. You still are. But you are too educated now. You forget that when you first had your symptoms, you didn't think, okay, I'll go and lie on a couch for 5 times a week and learn something about my unconscious for 10 years. That was not your plan. Your plan was to get rid of the symptom by whatever means necessary. So that's how your patients think. So when they come to you saying, I've got this feeling, will you take it away, please? There are two ways you can answer it. One way you can answer it is as follows. Yes, of course, take this pill. It will take away that feeling. I don't mean any disrespect to psychopharmacology, but that is the approach of psychopharmacology. It's a very powerful thing to have. There are patients who cannot cope with their feelings. There are patients whose lives are in danger because of their feelings. There are patients who cannot function, who can never take part in psychotherapy because of their feelings. I do not mean to disparage psychopharmacology when I say that that's one approach and it is the symptomatic treatment. It is not a causal treatment because the feelings are not the cause of the patient's problem. The feelings are the consequence of the patient's problem. The patient's problem is that they're doing something in the world to meet a need that isn't working. That's why they're suffering from a feeling. So you can take that feeling away and they will be grateful. They'll also have side effects. And you're also not really able to take the feelings away completely, as you all know. But that's one approach. And it has its great place in the clinical armamentarium at our disposal. Then there's another approach which says, not in these words, you don't say this to your patient. Please remember, I'm being didactic. I'm teaching you. You are not my patients. I'm not speaking to my patient. And I'm saying this because I've been traumatized. I've heard after speaking to colleagues, do you know Mark Solms teaches his patients? And he says to them, this about your brain. Of course I don't. I'm saying it to you, okay, so that you understand the underlying principle. The underlying principle is not in these words do you say to your patient, but you convey it to your patient. You are not suffering from feelings. You're suffering from something that you're doing which is causing those feelings. And so if I'm going to treat you, if I'm going to cure your ailment, if I'm going to give a causal intervention, then we have to look at what is it that you're doing which is causing these feelings, because you've got to do something different in your life. That will take away these feelings. That, my dear colleagues, is the single most important thing I can say to you today, is that is what psychotherapy does. All psychotherapy, more or less, one way or another, not only psychoanalytic psychotherapy, is aimed at helping our patients to do something differently in their lives that works better. And that something in question has to do with meeting their needs primarily their emotional needs, which are very hard things to do, as I summarized for you yesterday. Each one of them is hard to meet, let alone to reconcile with each other. And of course, it makes a great difference what kind of world you find yourself in. Some of us have parents who help us, others have parents who make things darn-side harder than they have to be in terms of learning how to meet our emotional needs in life. But that is the starting point. That's the meaning of the second sentence on the screen. Why our patients suffer mainly from feelings is because psychopathology arises from, the feelings that they suffer from arises from the fact that they have automatized, that they are automatically, unthinkingly, compulsively, repetitively doing something that is intended to meet their emotional needs, and it doesn't work. But they're doing it anyway, and they don't know that this relates to an emotional need which is causing them to have the feelings that they have. This leads to the third line on the screen, which is the meaning of symptoms. A symptom is, at bottom, an attempt to meet an emotional need that isn't working. It's a maladaptive attempt to meet an emotional need. A symptom is an intentional act. This is also something that we know. It's something that the patient is trying to achieve something through their symptom. This is a very different approach to psychopathology than giving a pill. And please remember what I said to you yesterday about the neurochemistry of these different emotional need systems, that they do have a neurochemistry, that you can regulate these systems psychopharmacologically, but that what you're doing there intervenes in something which is an inherently psychosocial system. They are not chemistry sets. You can't just add dopamine and see me in the morning. It just doesn't work like that. These systems work in relation to our meaningful object relationships, to the social and psychological life of the patient. These systems are inherently psychologically meaningful systems. When a patient feels despair, it means something. When a patient feels fear, it means something. Despair means I have tried to achieve reunion with a love object and I have not succeeded. I have lost her and I am now hopeless. That's what it means. I elaborated all of this yesterday. I can only say it in short terms today. If a patient's suffering from fear, it means that they're trying to get away from something that's persecuting them and they're not something that's attacking them, something that they believe will do them harm. And they're not able, they're not doing it. It's not working. So they continue to feel fear. Feelings mean something. This is the basis of the psychological approach to psychiatry. You can, especially since you eat it.
Just try to make my mind clear. Would you say that there is an inclination to feel something like I am a panic kind of person? You say there is a personal inclination. And then would you say that this is a declarative memory? So it works like that. So whenever I refer to anything, all my memory traces would be in this way written there. Like I would have these panic feelings, like as you used to say, that the color of my memory traces would be colored with this feeling of panic.
Well, I'm not sure that I'm following you, Irit, so let me try to answer it and then you tell me where I'm not getting it. Okay. First of all, memory traces are not colored with feeling. Memory traces are unconscious things. Remember the very beginning when I said yesterday you have that statement of Freud's that there are quotas of affect which are spread over the memory traces of ideas. That's what renders them conscious, to use the old phraseology that Freud did. In other words, that has to be the drive energy has to activate the representation. And then it becomes, that's when it has consciousness and color. Otherwise, it's just an automatic, unconscious prediction. It's just a trace. It's an automatism. There's no flavor there. The thing is that it has intentionality in the sense that it was originally designed to achieve something. What it was designed to do was to get rid of this feeling. This feeling represents that need. So here's a need. It announces itself to the mind in terms of a feeling, and you say, I'll do this to get rid of that feeling. In other words, to resolve the affect. In other words, to meet the need. If that thing doesn't work, you will be left with the need. So there you've got a memory trace, here you've got a feeling, and because you have repressed that memory trace, in other words, when it doesn't work, normally what happens is an affect renders this prediction salient. In other words, it means this prediction doesn't work, so I have to activate that prediction. The memory trace then has a quota of affect spread over it so that I can become conscious of it, so that I can problematize it and I can rethink it and reconsolidate it as a different memory trace. That's what normally happens. But when it is non-declarative, in other words, cannot be brought back to mind, which includes the repressed, then you have this colorless, flavorless, unconscious thing that you do, and you have this feeling, and the two never meet each other. That's the problem. That's the essence of the problem. And so in the case of panic, I have a need to keep my love object close to me, and I'm losing her. And so I'm in a panic, and so I do this, and it doesn't work. So I do this, and it doesn't work. So I do this, and it doesn't work. So I try something else, and it doesn't work, and eventually say, shit, nothing's going to work. All I'm ever going to think about is I can't help it. I'm losing my object. I'm losing my object. I can't think about anything else. I can't learn how to do my schoolwork. I can't fasten my shoelaces. I can't eat it. No, I'm not going to think about it anymore. I'm going to do this, even though it doesn't work. And then you do this, and you do this, and you do this, and it doesn't work, and it doesn't work, and it doesn't work. But at least you're able to think about something else and solve problems that you can. Now you're suffering from a feeling called panic, and you don't know why. And you don't know that what you're doing is meant to meet this need, but it isn't meeting this need, and so you're left with panic, and so your patient suffers from a feeling. And you can either treat the feeling with a pill, and they'll carry on doing this, which won't meet their need, and now they won't know that they're not meeting their need, to the degree that you're actually able to take away the feeling, which you never really can completely. Or you can say, look, this feeling means something. This feeling means you're doing something to meet this need, and it doesn't work. So let's do something else. That's the aim of psychotherapy, and that is the actual task of psychoanalytical treatment. And it's not only psychoanalytical treatment, it's all psychotherapies more or less. Okay. I'll come to that.
So here is the place where you say consolidation is the thing. But when we take it up into clinic, then you say that the lost memory or other elements inside this memory will take it off. Is it what you're saying?
What I'm saying is that normally what we do, this is called the reality principle, okay? Which means facing facts and learning from how things work, even though it isn't how you want them to work. So you say, I'm going to do this. That will bring mummy back. Doesn't work. Okay, well, that's a fact. It doesn't make me happy, but clearly this doesn't work. Let me try something else. That's reconsolidation, okay? If this worked, you would consolidate it, and it would take away the panic. If it doesn't work, the panic will carry on, so this won't become consolidated. It'll constantly be updated, updated, updated. That's reconsolidation. But repression consists in not updating the prediction even though it doesn't work, which means it is no longer available for reconsolidation. That's the essence of what repression is. So the mechanism, when I say that the task of psychological treatment is to help our patients to learn to do something differently to meet their needs in the world, that task is very difficult because they cannot reconsolidate what they're doing now. That's the essence of the problem that I'm putting to you. Because what they're doing now is non-declarative. It cannot be brought back to mind. This is the essential problem that we face. And now this is where I want to draw a distinction. When I say the actual task of psychoanalytic treatment, I want to draw a distinction between psychological treatment or psychotherapy in general and psychoanalysis in particular. This is an important preliminary statement before I move on to what is the specifically psychoanalytic task. In psychotherapy, we are trying to help our patients to find better ways to meet their needs in the world, especially their emotional needs in the world. And to the extent that what they're doing is declarative, to that extent, our task is not a specifically psychoanalytic one. And there are many things that our patients do that they can think about that are declarative, that are, in other words, pre-conscious. They don't want to think about them, but they can. And that is, for example, the major school of psychotherapy called CBT is predicated on the fact that there is a lot that we do that we can think about and therefore can reconsolidate in order to meet our needs better in the world. I don't want to bash psychopharmacology, nor do I want to bash CBT, because as much as this is about science and about evidence, you have to accept there's a lot of evidence that a lot of people are helped simply by thinking through the way that they're doing things and doing them better. And then they meet their needs better, and then they're helped, and then they don't need anything more. And in the early stages of a psychoanalytic treatment, I submit to you, we do that too. In other words, the things that the patient is able to think about, that they can see, yes, I'm doing that, yes, that's why I'm doing it, yes, I can see it doesn't work, they can change it. And they do. And to that extent, our approach, or at least in the early stages of a psychoanalytic treatment with a relatively healthy patient, obviously in the early stages of a psychoanalytic treatment with a deeply narcissistic patient, you don't have the luxury of thinking things through together, because you're under fire from day one. Because there's a different business going on there. But to the extent that you're dealing with neurotic processes, to that extent you really can help like that. It's not the whole thing, but there's some patients in whom that's the whole thing. Okay, so I don't want to underestimate it, because I'm going to say it one more time. There are many things that our patients do not want to think about, but they can think about them, and that is not the repressed. The repressed, by definition, cannot be thought about. Even Freud said that. You cannot think the repressed. You cannot bring it back to mind. It never leaves the unconscious and floats up into the preconscious and turns into something preconscious. It always stays unconscious. And I've showed you a whole lot of new lines of evidence for that. It's not capable of becoming conscious. It's not even in images. It cannot be turned into images. It's not possible. So the repressed stays repressed. Then how on earth do we change that? That's what I want to move to next.
Can I ask a question?
Yes, where's the question? Yes. So
Now in the United States, we meet those who say, I was born a male, but I feel a woman.
yes.
Call me Nancy.
Call me Nancy. Oh, yes, yes.
Nancy, I understood. So, do you believe that this man doesn't need a treatment?
Doesn't need?
A treatment. A psychotherapeutic treatment. Just as David said, you are born a male, you are a male, and you are wrong thinking you are Nancy and you will be ever Nancy. What did I do? This is the problem today in the United States. Okay? How do you will tell you I don't need help. I feel fine. I feel Nancy. That's all.
Okay. I know there's another question here, so I'm going to answer that question, then I'll take your question. But then I really want to move on, because we've got 45 minutes to go, and I want to cover, because unlike what I said to you yesterday, today we have to stop in order to get to the clinical cases. So I want to cover certain material with you and leave time for questions at the end. So to answer your question, first of all, I'm not entirely sure how it relates to what I'm talking about, but that doesn't matter entirely. I will link it to what... Say that again?
This may repress
Repressed something. Oh, that's a possibility. It's a possibility, but it's also possibly not the case. Yes.
To answer this gentleman, in accordance with your main idea,
Yeah.
you see, the problem is that we cannot change this mental structure because it has been repressed, and this is why they have to undergo surgery. We have to change the sex organs because we are not able, specifically because we're not able to change the mental structure that has been ossified.
That's also the case sometimes, but not always. I want to tell you, and I don't want to get too distracted by this, because it's actually a very big topic all of its own. But yesterday when I spoke to you about the 7 emotional systems, one of them was lust, which is the sexual instinct. And I spoke about it being sexually dimorphic. And I said that there are male and female sexual circuits in mammal brains, human brains included. And really, please understand, what I'm saying is not because I'm a politician trying to win you over to support a particular ideology. I'm saying there is a very great deal of evidence that there are bisexual circuits in the human brain, as there are in all mammals. Is extremely strong experimental evidence for this. Then there's the question of how does the one circuit over the other come to dominate? And I'm speaking not about psychodynamics yet. I'm talking about absolutely basic id functions. That is to say, given innate biological functions that apply to everyone. It's not individualized. It's just how you're born. That in utero, there are complicated processes whereby, first of all, the body is sexualized. The design of the human body is female. In fact, of all mammal bodies, is female. If you leave it to its own devices, it will become female. You have to do something to the fetal body to turn it into a male one. And what happens is, at around 8 weeks of gestation, if you have the XY pair on the 23rd chromosome, on the Y chromosome, there is a little sequence of genes which produces something called TDF, testes determining factor. TDF is a chemical which your gonads, which would become ovaries if you left them to their own devices. That's their natural destination. If you add TDF to gonads, they don't become ovaries, they become testicles. That is, by the way, the only genetically determined difference between males and females is on that pair of chromosomes, TDF is produced, which masculinizes the gonads. Once you've got masculinized gonads, in other words, you've got testicles, that produces testosterone. And that is the part that happens around 8 weeks. The testosterone then masculinizes the body. There are the same number of testosterone receptors in males and females. There's no difference. It's just that if you've got more testosterone, those receptors, the little keys will fit the locks, and then the genes will be activated to masculinize the body, will be expressed to masculinize the body. And we both have the same possibilities, but the males, the ones who have the testosterone, if you take an XX fetus and you add testosterone, its body will also become masculinized. This definitely happens. Now, in some mammals, it's even more complicated because the testosterone has to be converted into dihydrotestosterone, and that is with 5-alpha reductase. And why I'm mentioning all these complexities is because things can go wrong. There's many a slip between cup and lip. And in biology, things happen by degrees. And so some XY, chromosomally XY fetuses, their bodies are not masculinized. And they carry on with a female body even though they're XY. And we see this in the Olympic Games all the time. They used to test, when they could in the 70s, test chromosomally. They thought, now we'll know who's the males and who's the females. And it's not true. Because you can be XY and you can have a vagina. Born like that. So that happens at 8 weeks of gestation. Your body is masculinized, but it does not cross the blood-brain barrier. Testosterone, dihydrotestosterone doesn't cross the blood-brain barrier, so the brain is not masculinized. It is only at the end of the second trimester of pregnancy that again a wave of testosterone produced by the testicles, if you've got them and to the extent that you've got them, which has to be converted by aromatase in order for it to cross the blood-brain barrier, only then is your brain masculinized. And that's another complicated process, and we know, for example, that stress, and we know this experimentally, we can do it. You can stop the brain from being masculinized just by stressing the pregnant mum. And I'm speaking about, obviously, we don't do these experiments on humans, but we all have the same mechanisms, us mammals, and you can prevent the brain from masculinizing. And stress is something, that's nothing to do with the psychodynamics of the individual who's born. The stress of the mother. For example, there was a study done during the bombing of Germany, and there was a massive increase in non-masculinized brains during that period of time because of the stress that those mothers went through. Presumably, that's a rough and ready experiment because it's done retrospectively. But these things happen, and so you can be born into a body which does not coincide with the gender of your brain. That we need to accept. Then, on top of that, there's all the psychodynamics that comes with that. And then that's not the only way that you can feel that you're not in the right body. You can feel that way for all sorts of psychodynamic reasons. And so that leads me to bring me back to my narrative. What you start with is, let me see to what extent can I understand this with the patient. To what extent can the patient think about what need is not being met here? One of those needs is in the lust system. Okay? And then eventually you hit a bedrock. And then we start with psychoanalytic mechanisms, which I'm going to talk about now. And then beneath that, there's another bedrock, which is that not everything is repressed. Some things are before that, and that's what I was speaking about when I speak about what happens in utero. One more question.
Does all you say mean that recording of your sexual abuse is not a real thing?
No, I'm not saying that the recalling of sexual abuse is not a real thing. I'm saying nothing new on this score. There are people who've been sexually abused. God knows that that happens. And that there are people who've been sexually abused who do something in consequence. In other words, who, in trying to solve this problem, how do I deal with the fact that my uncle or my father comes into my room at night and does this thing to me? All of the feelings that it evokes in me, and they are very complicated, overwhelming feelings, because there are multiple need systems involved there. It's very common that the person has no way of being able to solve this, and what they then do is they come up with a solution which they then repress, which is then no longer available, but that's not the only way. There are also people who do not do that, and who remember what happened, and who don't want to think about it, and who later can think about it.
Recording itself in data.
Yes.
Possible?
Of course it's possible, yes, but not if it's repressed.
If the adult suddenly recalls
Yes.
thing, is it real for you?
Well, if the... So what she's saying is, memories of abuse. Am I, Mark Solms, saying, yes, these are real? And we're in a contested territory, so I want to just calm the temperature down first of all. Okay, I am not the devil, and I'm not, I want us to just face facts, and they're quite simple, calm facts. So first of all, there are people who've been abused. That happens. Okay? Secondly, there are people who've been abused who will never remember it, even though they have been abused. And we will only be able to infer it from the reconstructions. Then there are people who've been abused who do remember it, and that means they didn't repress what happens. It means that they suppressed it or dissociated from it. And you all know these things, that there are people who know but don't know. And those patients can be helped to remember, and they can remember in detail. Then there are grades between that and another extreme, which is people who remember something that never happened. And this we also know happens, and we can even make it happen. Experimentally, it's very easy to induce false memories. And there's everything in between that. There are the veridical memories, there are false memories, and then there's all degrees of fantasy and reality which merge with each other. So it's a complex array of things. But the crucial bit for my presentation today, which is what I'm now going to move on to, is that unfortunately, there are people who cannot remember what they've repressed. That's what it means to say it's repressed. You can never remember what's been repressed. It doesn't mean that everything that you cannot remember is repressed. Some of them are suppressed, and that's what I was just saying. There are patients who don't want to think. I myself don't want to think about many things, and so I don't. Okay, but once upon a time, I lay on the couch 5 times a week, and I thought about many things I didn't want to think about, and it helped me a great deal to think them through and to reach a rational adult. Because remember, many of the solutions that you came to that you don't want to revise, you came to long ago when you weren't as clever as you are now, and you weren't as independent and capable as you are now, and you didn't have a psychoanalyst there to help you think it through. You had some crazy aunt instead. Okay? So now, that's one thing. But now the main focus I want to move to now is that there's another thing, which is things you cannot bring back to your mind no matter how hard you try. And I'm saying that this is the specific type of psychopathology that we in psychoanalysis and psychoanalytic psychotherapy are specialized in treating. And we do not treat it by bringing it back to mind, because you can't. So now the question is, what do you do instead? And that's what I want to move on to. So this is the actual task of psychoanalytic treatment. Okay, now I'm going to speak about countertransference and about transference. When I said our patients suffer mainly from feelings, what that means is our patients are conscious of something even if they've repressed what it is that's leading to the feeling. They are conscious of the feeling, and the feeling will tell us something about what emotional need is not being met here. And this, we're going to look at two cases after this where I'm going to illustrate that. It's a very simple thing, and I want to emphasize this now because I don't want to spend too much time giving lessons when we get to the cases. I'm saying this to you with all love as my colleagues. This is what I have learned. I might be wrong, okay, but I think that this is helpful. It's been helpful to me, so I put it to you. You can use it yourself. It might be helpful to you. I find in the most concrete psychiatric sense of the word, in other words, like taking a history in the ordinary medical sense, I want to know what the patient is suffering from in terms of their feelings. Because that tells me, regardless of what they can and can't remember, that tells me something about where the problem lies. In other words, I can infer that because the patient is suffering from rage, that there is something that's frustrating them, something that's impeding them, something getting between themselves and what they want, and they're trying to get rid of that thing, but they can't. That's why the rage is not resolved. It's not working. Okay, so I have a clue that this patient, what's repressed in this patient, is a prediction which has to do with how do I get rid of this obstacle, this impediment, this frustrating object. They're doing something, they're doing it automatically, they're doing it unthinkingly, and it isn't working, so that's what I must look for. Okay? What I've just described to you, that feeling is the rage, the irritability, the anger of the patient. I'm saying this again, it's a very concrete, simple thing. Don't make it too complicated. Don't be spooky about it. Just ask yourself, what is the patient feeling? Normally, it's the presenting complaint. Normally, the patient will tell you in words, this is my problem. And you want to know what the feeling is. And in relation to the 7 emotional instinctual systems I told you about, it's a map. I don't mean you sit on the edge of your chair with a map and you tick off which of the 7. I mean, you internalize this knowledge that these are the basic emotional need systems. The affects that our patients suffer from mean something in relation to those need systems. So when the patient suffers from a feeling, I want to know which feeling is it. That's my first starting point in order to be able to infer what is repressed, because you will never remember what is repressed. The patient can't tell you what's repressed because it's repressed. It's non-declarative, which means non-declarable. So you have to infer it, and your first clue is the affect. Now, I put the word countertransference here because not all patients can tell you in words what they're suffering from. This is the meaning of the word countertransference, and I would like to broaden it even further. It used to be countertransference meant I, the analyst, feel something because the patient has touched on a raw nerve. In other words, they've touched on something repressed in me. And so the affect comes up in me. It's my problem. Then the Kleinians expanded our understanding of the meaning of countertransference, and they said, in addition to that, there are many more times when you feel something in response to the patient, which doesn't have to do with you, it has to do with the patient. And they infer this mechanism, or they discovered this mechanism called projective identification, which is in fact due to the blurring of the boundaries between subject and object in narcissistic processes that I described to you yesterday, where the feeling that belongs to the patient is located in the analyst. And so there's a different meaning of the word countertransference, and it's specific to narcissistic object relations. And I'm saying, and there's also even a broader category than that. It's not always only in terms of projective identification. There are also other ways in which the patient doesn't know that they have a feeling that belongs to them. But in the countertransference, you feel the feeling. And I don't want to emphasize the countertransference and the feeling of feelings which don't belong to you, but rather belong to, because that's not the rule. The rule is the simple one. The patient says, I'm suffering from depression. The patient says, I'm having panic attacks. The patient says, I feel anxious all the time and I don't know why. So mostly it's easy, but sometimes it's not so easy, and that's where we have recourse to the concept of countertransference. But all of this relies upon one fact only, which is that affects are conscious. The patient doesn't always know that their affects belong to them. But affects are conscious things, and they're easily observable, and that's the place we start. Our patients suffer mainly from feelings, and it's a very concrete, simple thing. I'm saying it to you not because I want to sound concrete and simple. I'm saying it to you because the life of the mind is a forest. It's a thicket. It's very difficult to find your way around. It's an extremely complicated, extremely easy to get lost in place. So those things which are simple that we can hold on to, let's hold on to them. Affects are conscious, and they're easily observed relative to what is repressed. And that's where we start. I'll illustrate it with the cases later, and that's the first point I wanted to make. Now we lead to transference. The patient is going to repeat. By transference, let me remind you, and let me first of all remind you, Erik told you, I am the authorized English translator of Freud. I know Freud's work, okay? So when I say to you, Freud said this, please believe me. Freud's meaning of the word transference is not only what the patient feels about the analyst. Transference is everything that the patient repeats in their contemporary object relationships, which derives from repressed infantile object relationships. Everything. So what they do in relation to their boss and their spouse and their children and their whatever, the police, that's also transference. So if the patient has a repressed prediction, in other words, when they have this need and they need to meet that need, they do that thing that's aimed at meeting this need, but it doesn't work. It doesn't matter. It's automatized. They'll do it over and over again. That is transference. That thing that they do over and over again, which is trying to meet a need, the thing that I said means something, that I said is an intentional act. It's an attempt to meet a need. I said the symptom is an attempt to meet a need. It is the transference. It's a thing that is unconscious, that they are doing over and over again, and so they're going to be doing it in the present, and you're going to see it. The best way to see it is when they do it with you in the consulting room. That's the easiest, most concrete, most direct, and also therefore the most available to talk about. But you must remember that transference is not only about you. Okay. So you're looking, what is this patient doing? What are they repeating? What are they transferring from the repressed into their present object relationships? And you have a good idea where to look because of the affect. The affect tells you this patient's doing something to keep their love object close to them. That's not working. This patient's doing something to get away from a dangerous attacker. That's not working. This patient is doing something to, etc. Okay? That helps you to look for what kind of transference am I looking for. And again, you're not going to sit on the edge of your chair with the recipe book. You internalize this knowledge, and it comes to you in the same way as all your other psychoanalytic knowledge comes to you. You just, eventually, this is just the way that you think. But it's worthwhile having very explicit the rules of the game so that you can slowly consolidate them and automatize them. At this point, they're declarative, and I'm telling you. There are two things. The one is the patient will suffer from a feeling, and it won't be that hard to find what it is. That's your starting point. The second thing is that that feeling gives you an indication as to what sort of thing they're doing, because what it's aimed at, which need. So it gives you a sense of what sort of object relationship you're looking for in the transference, in the broad sense of the word, and then that is your second thing, your second clue. What the patient is doing now is a repetition, is an expression of, it's a manifestation of the repressed. This, by the way, is classical theory. What I'm telling you here when I say the transference is merely an externalization in the present of what is in the internal unconscious world of the patient is not something new, I'm telling you. What I'm telling you, though, is this, which is the important part. The patient, by looking at by recognizing the transference repetition, which takes the form, and I need to emphasize this too, because this is new. It takes the form of a prediction of what must I do. The patient is doing something in order to meet a need. That is what is transferred. a prediction in action. This is what I'm doing to meet my need. They just don't know that they're doing it, but they do it, and you can see that's what they're doing. That thing they can never bring back to mind. In other words, they will never remember, yes, that's how I decided to deal with my Oedipus complex. That's how I decided to deal with my oral ambivalence toward my mother. You know, they will never remember it, but they will repeat it. And I told you how you can identify, how you can be in the right ballpark. However, what the patient can think about is what they're doing now. That is, because they're doing it now, it is available to declarative memory and working memory. You can draw the patient's attention to what they're doing now. In other words, to the derivative of the repressed. This is why transference is important. And I'm coming from a completely different explanatory point of view, from a completely different evidential base to a conclusion that we were driven to anyway, long, long ago. We just understand it differently now. That why transference is so important is it's the only way you can ever identify what is repressed, because you can never bring it back to mind. You can only know the repressed via its derivatives, and it will, of necessity, be repeated. That's of the essence of what these unconscious automatic predictions are for. It's what do I do when I have this need? I do this thing. Which need are we talking about? The one the patient's suffering from, because that's the thing they're doing that isn't working. That's the basic idea. The patient can think about what they're doing now. So now listen to me carefully, please, because I'm talking to you about transference interpretation. By the way, although I trained in London, I had a right-wing Freudian analyst. Okay, I did not train as Betty Joseph was not my analyst. I have come to my analyst would turn in his grave if he heard me saying to you that Betty Joseph technique in this respect is probably the right one. Okay? Many things I'm telling you which have been hard-won, painfully won insights. I really believe it. I've seen it now. I'm doing this with all my colleagues. We're working together. We're doing it in our own practices. It comes from the basis of what I've told you. This is the reason why we do it. You've got to focus on the transference, because only there can the patient actually change. The patient can only problematize what they're doing now. That means they can only reconsolidate what they're doing now. So the aim of transference interpretation is to show the patient, you are doing this now with me, or with your wife, or with your boss, in order to meet this need. And can you see it doesn't work? Now, again, I'm not using those words. Please remember, Mark Solms doesn't teach his patients neuropsychoanalysis. Mark Solms teaches his colleagues neuropsychoanalysis, and his colleagues know how to use tact and appropriate clinical communication. You don't give your patients lessons in neuropsychoanalysis. You, in your own way, in your own words, using it in a way that works with that particular patient, what you're trying to convey to the patient is draw their attention to this thing that they're doing in the transference and show this thing that they're doing is meant to achieve this outcome, and it is not achieving this outcome. That's why they're feeling this. That is linking the affect that they're suffering from to what they're doing in order to meet the underlying need. But it is not bringing the repressed back. The repressed is still there, and that has consequences which I'm going to come to. But this thing is a transference interpretation which, when it's right, has enormous emotional power, because for the first time, the patient links up what they're doing with what they're suffering from. The affect that they're suffering from is reconnected to what they're doing, not to the original repressed prediction coming back to mind, but to its derivative in the transference to what they're doing here and now, which they can think about because it's here, perceivable, thinkable, declarable, cortical, conscious, makeable now. That's the aim of transference interpretation. Now, once you've done that and the patient is deeply moved by the insight that they've gained, because it is an insight, they recognize, my God, I'm doing this. My God, I'm doing this in order to achieve that. My God, it's a stupid thing to do. My God, that's why I feel like this. My God, I've got an insight. Okay? Once you've done that, on the session on Monday, What happens on Tuesday is they do it again. Okay? That doesn't change them. Even though it's genuine insight, the patient is not changed. In the sense that they don't suddenly lose their symptom. They don't suddenly stop doing it. And what do you do then? Do you say, oy vey, I give up on you? Or do you say the same interpretation? Can you see you're doing it again? You're doing it again because you're trying to do this. Can you see? That's why you're doing that. Can you see? Doesn't work. Can you see? That's why you're feeling this. Can you see? Boo-hoo-hoo, yes, I see it again. And then comes Wednesday or Thursday, they do it again.
Are you saying that the past, present, and the future is in the emotion?
The past is timeless in the repressed. Okay? But it is repeated in the present, and you can make the patient aware of what they're doing in the present, that they can problematize and they can do it differently. But it's hard to do it because it doesn't take away what's repressed. So what's repressed carries on being automatically repeated because it's not been taken away, because it can't be reconsolidated. What can be reconsolidated is the derivative of the repressed that can be changed. And it has to be done many times, and I'll tell you why. First of all, I just want to remind you, empirically, it is a fact that it has to be done many times. That our patients don't get better quickly. You've got to tell the insurance companies that. The medical insurance companies have to learn how learning works. Okay? The non-declarative memory systems, there's a rule. Hard to learn and hard to forget. It's a scientific fact. They need to learn that. We can't speed it up. What I've just described, easy to learn is the emotional memory systems. Procedural memory systems, hard to learn. Both of them, hard to forget. That is to say, the non-declarative memory is compulsively, automatically repeated, always. And you can't change it. And all the evidence speaks for that. You can never take it away. But that doesn't mean you must give up. I'll tell you, don't worry, there's good news coming. But these are the bad news facts. So you take what can be thought about, which is the derivative of the repressed, the transference, what they're doing now in consequence of the unconscious prediction. They are executing the unconscious prediction, and you can say, look what you're doing now. Not in these words and not in that tone of voice, but that's what you're doing, okay? And then the patient learns over and over and over again, and that's called working through. It takes time, and it can't be avoided. That's why we have many sessions and frequent sessions, and we wish it was quicker, but it isn't. Can't be. Sorry. How working through works is that the patient now starts to consolidate a new way of meeting that need. By consolidating the new way of meeting that need, they do not get rid of the old way of meeting that need. That's why they can always regress. People can always get worse again, especially under stress. It happens. I hope you've noticed it happens even to our beloved selves. We go back to our old ways. Because they're still there. They never go away. I'll come to you in a second. I will. But this new thing that they've learned, which they've learned and learned and learned and learned by you interpreting it over and over and over again in the transference, called working through, why that gets consolidated is because it works better. It actually meets the need. And so when the patient, once this has been sufficiently consolidated, they have now a need. They've got two things they can do. They can do this new thing, which is relatively less secure, less consolidated, but it works. Or they can do this other thing that doesn't work, that they now have an alternative to, and slowly the balance shifts in favor of the new thing. And this is why working through ultimately works. The patient now has, and that carries on, they carry on consolidating it. Now I want to tell you something. I'm going to come to you, but there are a few things I need to say. I want to tell you something. When the patient repeats it, and you say, and you interpret it, and you interpret it, and you're doing it again, you're doing it again, you're doing it again, eventually there comes a time when the patient says to themselves, I'm doing it again. At that point, they don't need you anymore. Then the analysis can end, and the patient carries on analyzing themselves. In other words, the working through continues after the end of the treatment. Why do I say that to you? it's because I want to give you some criterion for when do we end a treatment, but also because I want to make sense of a piece of evidence that I don't know why, but the clinicians in our field don't know this evidence. And it's very important evidence, so I'm now going to report it to you. In the old days, when evidence-based medicine started, we said, we don't play that game. We know that what we're doing works and you can't measure it. And then everybody else did play that game, and they measured their successes, and everybody said, this is evidence-based medicine, psychoanalysis is not, and so whoomph, they all went and did those other treatments. And then some of us woke up, whoops, we made a mistake there, and so we started to measure what we do, using their tools, because now they dominated the game, and we had to use their tools to measure what we do, which is not the best way to measure what we do. But those became the gold standard. So we have to use Beck depression inventory and Spielberger anxiety, measuring our patient's symptoms. And not the structural change, but the symptoms. And now we've been doing that for a sufficient period of time for me to tell you something. Because now we know there's enough evidence for us to have reached evidence-based conclusions, which is the following. On average, if you even everything else out between CBT and psychoanalytical treatment, when I say even everything else out, I mean use their measurement tools and have their dosage. In other words, that number of sessions over that period of time. On average, with all disorders, on average, the outcomes are the same. I don't know if that's good or bad news. But remember, it's dosage controlled, same number of sessions over same number of months, usually months, sometimes a year or two, At the end of the treatment, on average, the outcomes are the same. And this is the latest results of the latest meta-analyses. I'm not telling you something controversial. The question of the mechanism is another matter, but that's the outcome. Then what happens next is slowly the symptomatic improvement of CBT declines. In other words, slowly the patients get worse again. And therefore, they give top-up treatments. What happens at the end of a psychoanalytic treatment is not that the patient's benefits stay. They continue to improve. They get better and better and better after the treatment. It's called the sleeper effect. And I believe the mechanism of the sleeper effect is what I've just told you, that working through carries on after the end of the treatment. Okay, so now I want to, now I'll answer your question, but I haven't finished and I've got 13 minutes.
Seems to me from what you say that there's a need for practicing new behaviors, not only understanding in order to make change.
Yes.
So like learning a new
Yes.
pattern. So I would think that there's a need not only for talking about it, but for really
Coaching.
So what our colleague is saying, what I'm saying, she's saying, she sees what I'm saying is the patient has to learn new patterns of behavior. That's what they have to do. And I would like to say, first of all, Eric Kandel, who was the professor of Yoram Yuval, Eric Kandel, who is a sort of an ambivalent friend of psychoanalysis, but who knows a lot about the brain mechanisms of memory, he said exactly what you've just said, that in the end, all psychotherapy is learning. Okay, now, I'm saying that he's right, but I want to qualify it and say there's learning and there's learning. Okay, so there's learning which is declarative, where the actual mechanism of the problem that you're trying to undo is also declarative, and that is not psychoanalytical psychotherapy. That is various forms of rational, cognitive reasoning with the patient, helping them to learn. It can be coaching, as you just jokingly said, can be CBT. Those are also learning, but the important thing is it's mainly declarative. That's not exclusively declarative, but it's mainly declarative. And certainly their conceptualization of what they're doing is mainly declarative. But then there are non-declarative things that have to happen too, and psychoanalytical treatment is also a form of learning, but it's learning, it's relearning, it's reproblematizing. It's how do you change that which cannot be changed, which is the unconscious, non-declarative predictions. And our way of doing it is by focusing not on the unconscious predictions themselves, but rather on their derivatives in the present, which are conscious, which can be made conscious. You can direct consciousness to them, which means that you can attach affect to them. And that can be changed, and with sufficient amount of repetition, that can be consolidated. And it then competes with the previous repressed prediction, and it has the advantage of being better at meeting the need. And so it will progressively continue to be consolidated, and it will never take away what's repressed. It will add to what is non-declarative. There will be alternatives, and all the evidence suggests that that's how non-declarative learning works. It's accumulative, it's by accretion. It's not by extinction. So now I want to tell you some further technical implications of what I've just said. The aim of transference reconstruction, because it is reconstruction, not remembering. The aim of transference reconstruction is not an end in itself. And I know I'm saying something which by this point I hope will be obvious to you, that the aim of reconstruction in transference analysis is not an end. It's in the service of something else. Why we are trying to reconstruct the past is in order to understand the present. That's the end. In other words, we're trying to understand why is the patient doing what they're doing now with their current objects. How we understand it is, first of all, identify the affect that they're suffering from. Secondly, look in the right ballpark in order to understand what type of need are they trying to meet. In other words, what type of thing are they likely to be doing? What kind of goal are they trying to achieve? Then you see in the transference, in the broader sense of the word, of how what idiotic thing are they doing over and over again in their current object relationships of this kind. And then you can reconstruct from that, where does this come from? And it is guesswork. It's an inference. You will never bring back the repressed memory. It can't be brought back. But the reason why you're wanting to understand it is so that then you'll have a better sense of what they're doing now and why. So it's in order to try to improve your understanding of what the patient is doing now, so that you can change what the patient's doing now. That's the end. Here's a complete truism, but it's also a sort of sad fact, that the only way our patients can get better is by changing what they do now. And our patients don't want to hear that. And this is why we have to remember it. The aim of transference analysis is not to wallow in the past. It is not an end in itself. You will get nowhere by reconstructing the transference, unless you realize it's in the service of understanding what the patient's doing now, because the patient, I'm afraid, has to change what they're doing now. It's the only way they can get better. Yes, please.
How would you put it in your, when you construct things now, if I understand the problems of today by reverting to certain, the mother was not available, this and that, and there is, and you say it's only, and I agree, it's not, sometimes it's memory, I mean, that evokes, but sometimes it's not clear, but there could be coming a grief about that. And as if it pertains to things happened in the past, and it happens now. But when you're saying it happens now because I talked about it or I kind of evoked it, so how that has to do with the here and now? But because it feels, as therapists, if you pass through this grief, you will be done with that.
Okay, that was the question about corrective emotional experience. So I'll come to that and what you're saying. But first, what you're saying reminds me or makes me want to say something else, which is not answering your question, first of all, okay? You said you have memories and so on. And that reminds me to say this. The patient can never revive into declarative working memory the repressed. It's not possible. But that doesn't mean they don't have fragments And I spoke about this yesterday under the heading of screen memories. They're little bits and pieces that they can remember. And that helps us to reconstruct what is repressed. I know that's not answering your question, but I just wanted to say that because you reminded me that I hadn't said that. Now, I understand what you're asking, and I want to explain how I think it works, which then answers what you're asking. It's an indirect route I'm taking to what you're asking. But in the end, if I haven't got properly what you're getting at, tell me. Okay. When we're reconstructing, we're wanting to understand why is the patient doing what they're doing now. We know roughly what they're doing, but it's hard to make sense of it, and the patient has to problematize what they're doing now. So the more they understand what they're trying to achieve by what they're doing now, the better they'll be able to, the more insight they'll have, the more scope there is for them changing what they're doing, because the more it's problematized, the more the gap between what they're actually trying to do in the reality principle, in the depressive position, is clear in contradistinction to what they're doing in the pleasure principle and the paranoid schizoid position. So that's what you're trying to minimize so that they can see, with your help and with their adult mind and with all of their reflective consciousness, which is now a very powerful tool, in the process of doing that. We go into the past in order to be able to understand what they're doing now, so that they can understand what they're doing now, so that they can problematize what they're doing now, so that they can change what they're doing now. I say again, our patients don't want to change. Okay, it's very hard for them to change what they're doing now. Is the hardest thing in the world to do. Partly because this is the problem that they've never been able to solve. It's the problem that they've always been trying to avoid. And also because they've got another way of doing it, which is absolutely automatic, that they're unthinkingly doing all the time. So there's enormous pressure against, there's enormous resistance against helping the patient to see that this is what you're doing, this doesn't work, this is why you're doing it. That's the reconstruction part. And we can understand, you can be forgiven for doing this because it's understandable. You're doing this because of that, we think. But the only way you're going to get better is you mustn't do that anymore. Not giving an instruction, it's helping the patient to see themselves, to give them the freedom to see, my God, I don't have to do this. It doesn't make sense to do this. If I'm trying to achieve that, I should rather do something else. Now, that the patient wants to go back into the past. And this is why I'm saying we must remember it's in the service of this present task. Because what you find happens, I'll give you two examples. The one is that the patient says, yes, I know I'm doing this, but it's because of my mother. This is because my father left. Remember, that's why I'm doing this. You say, yeah, but your father left 30 years ago, but this is not going to change that now, you see. So there's a way, and I'm sorry, I know I'm saying something ridiculously obvious, but I'm telling you, I've seen it again and again and again and again in my own patients and in my colleagues' patients. It's a very common retreat, that we go into, that as if the past, because it explains the present, then, that means this is why it has to be like this. It doesn't have to be like this. And the second thing is that patients, the second example of why I'm saying that the emphasis has to be the way that it is that many patients feel when you clarify the transference, in other words, when you reconstruct the history, they feel, well, now I'm doomed. And this speaks much more directly to your question, that can't be fixed. I can never get my mother's love. I can never, this thing which is the only thing that I've ever wanted, which is actually the thing that's driven my whole structure of my life, the whole source of my troubles, it can't ever be fixed. And this speaks to the question of a corrective emotional experience. It can never be fixed. It can never be fixed what happened then. All that can be done is the patient can understand and accept what happened then and see its implications and its consequences for what they're doing now, so that they can do it differently now, because this person is not their mother, because this is not the past, because this is the source of their problems now, even though that is the proximal, the long ago source, the distal source. This is the proximal source, what they're doing now. And so the question of a corrective emotional experience, I do not believe in Nachträglichkeit, deferred action, with respect to the repressed. The repressed cannot be reconsolidated. So in that respect, I don't think it's a corrective emotional experience in that. And even Winnicott speaks as if you can sort of like undo that. You can't. But you can continue a developmental process which has been fixated. You can then release, and the patient can now, in the present, there you can have a reconsolidation, and there you can have a continuing emotional maturational process.
And I think it's what you're talking when you're talking about understanding.
Yes.
What is bluntly missing for me from your is empathy.
Is what?
Empathy. This is the vehicle to like, because understand what you can understand, this joke like, yeah, now I know why I pee, but I continue peeing, so it doesn't work, right? So it's not. So this working through has to the core of it.
Yeah.
Is really
So I'm sorry, I really understand what you're saying, and I'm going to cut you short because I want to say one more thing, but I want to say to you, I agree with you, and I apologize. It's correct. I'm not emphasizing appropriately the feelings of the analyst, the empathy of the analyst. When I spoke of countertransference earlier, I might as well have said empathy. And also we do this from our own self-understanding, of course, and we use our own humanity and the fact that we've had these struggles ourselves. And I'm emphasizing the logic of what we're doing, and I'm emphasizing the mechanism of what we're doing. And you're quite right that, what did you say, starkly leaves out of account the empathic side of it, the feeling side of it. Psychoanalysis is a cure by love. I firmly believe that. So I'm sorry if I have failed to sufficiently communicate that. But I want to end by saying this. Remember, we haven't finished. We're going to have coffee. And then we're going to come and have 2 cases, and then I'm going to be able to... But I want to say one last thing before I stop, which is that I've been speaking about how we make our patients conscious of what they're doing now, okay, so that they can reconsolidate these things and go and then add them to these things. What I have not said is that in addition to this, which is insight, which is declarative, which is making the patient reflectively aware of, etc., in addition, in parallel, just as happens throughout development, you are also influencing the patient directly in the non-declarative learning. This happens also automatically. The patient is taking things in. They're taking things in from you. I told Irit yesterday, after my analyst had a hip injury from the war, and he walked like this. And after a few years of analysis, my wife said to me, "Why are you limping?" And I was starting to walk like him. We never spoke about it. It had nothing to do with anything he ever said to me. I just took this thing in. I took, alongside everything else I took in from my analyst, I took in his limp. Okay, so I'm using that as a little silly, jokey example in order to make the more general point that we must not forget that we don't only learn through declarative memories and then into non-declarative. There's also direct non-declarative learning that happens. We're going to talk more. I'm sorry, I know there's some questions. Let's take those questions at the beginning of the session after coffee, and then we move on. But Irit looks like she wants to say something.